All right, well, let's get started. I've just posted homework number 8, and you've got all kinds of time to work on that assignment. It's not due till Wednesday of next week. So it's going to include a question related to the in-class exercise we're going to do today, and my suggestion is get an early start on that while it's still fresh in your mind. The other thing I'll mention is I sent you an email over the weekend with an audio file. And boy, it was like looking into the future, a future where professors don't have a job because that AI is so good at explaining things, right? I don't know if you listened to the file at all, but what it is basically is I loaded our project assignment description into this tool. It analyzed the assignment, and then it made a podcast explaining the assignment where two people are talking back and forth with some background information, talking about each of the 4 phases that you do before personalizing it. So I've been playing with that tool all weekend long, and it's just amazingly good at explaining complicated things. You can give it websites that you want it to analyze, videos, you can give it documents, and it will generate an audio summary or a text summary. The text summary is less impressive in my opinion, but the point is, if you're still not finding the impetus to get started on the project, then I think listening to that audio interview could be a way to kickstart things. And I'm getting people stopping by to check their spreadsheets, and that's fine. I'm glad to do that during my office hours. But what I'm not able to do, like, I just simply don't have the bandwidth to double check your work. You know, like there's 36 students in the class, and I can't troubleshoot everybody's spreadsheet. So if you want to come by and ask specific questions, I'll do that all day long. But what I can't do is have you email me your file and say, is this right? You know, I can't pre-grade it. So anyways, the project is due on the 20th of November. So time's just going to keep passing, and you'll get busier the semester goes. And so I'd suggest you get an early start on that. And I think listening to that audio interview is a good way to understand it a little bit better. Also, we don't have class on Friday because of October break. So that's not listed on the announcements there, but don't plan to come to school on Friday. So any questions about the announcements before we continue talking about incremental analysis? All right. Well, let's consider a world that you're just fabulously wealthy and you have to decide whether you want to get the airplane on the left or the airplane on the right. You know, engineering economy, this class is all about decision making and comparing alternatives to find out which is economically the most feasible. So the airplane on the left is known as the single greatest, it's the best single engine airplane out there in terms of long range, low cost, lots of capacity. It's made in Switzerland, very effective airplane. Goes plenty fast, in my opinion, more than 300 miles an hour. That'd get you where you need to go in a hurry. But, you know, big-time executives, they prefer jets. And so if you wanted a used Cessna Citation, you see here the initial purchase price is $4 million. For a new one, with all the latest in electronics and leather seats and everything, a new Cessna Citation XL is more than $16 million. But just in terms of the fuel cost, and they call it the engine reserve, which is where you're putting a little bit of money aside every hour that you're flying to rebuild the engine when it comes due for maintenance. The engine reserve, the operating costs due to other maintenance and inspection that has to be done, and then the fuel, $3,200 an hour. So very expensive to fly a jet around. In incremental analysis, what our technique would be is to say, what do you get for the extra $1.8 million? So the increment is the difference between two alternatives. So the incremental cost of $1.8 million, you're getting some increment in range, an increment in speed, and an increment in passenger capacity. So you can carry one additional passenger. You're going to be going an extra about 170 miles an hour, getting an extra 350 miles of range. But then on the negative side, the operating costs are higher as well. So that's what we're going to do today with incremental analysis. And we looked at something similar to this in a prior class meeting, where we said if we had two options, what we would do is we would order them with the cheaper option on the left and the more expensive option on the right, and then subtract B minus A. And so in this illustration, it would say it's an extra $20,000 upfront initial cost, but then the annual costs are lower and there's additional salvage value. So what we would do is we would analyze the rate of return on the increment and see how that compares to the MAR. So the minimum attractive rate of return tells us whether spending is justified or not justified. Like, for example, if your company can borrow money at a rate of 5% per year, and the more expensive option is going to yield 7% per year in additional profits, then you should do that. You should always borrow as much money as can be justified by the rate of return being greater than the MAR. So keep going for the larger option until the MAR is no longer satisfied. So that's kind of the decision criteria that we're going to see in a series of illustrations today. Now, I think at this point in the semester, we probably need to pause for a moment and just review some terminology, because there's a lot of different uses of the letter I, and I think it's probably getting a little bit confusing what all of the different I variables mean. And so when we started the semester talking about interest, interest amount is assigned the variable capital I. And remember, lenders demand interest because of the time value of money, the fact that the money that they get back in the future is less valuable than the money they loan you now at the present. And they're also demanding some interest to cover the risk of default or the interest rate risk. So interest amount is a capital I. When we express it as a rate, meaning as a percentage of the original amount and expressed in per time unit, so most typically it would be the interest rate as percent per year, that's lowercase I. So capital I is the amount, as a percentage is lowercase I. In our book, the book that I recommend you purchase as a supplementary resource, I star means the rate of return. And so if you are making an investment and you assume that the returns can be reinvested into the same project, then that's the internal rate of return. But we assign that I star as the variable, and then I prime is the external rate of return. So remember, internal rate of return is very kind of fringe and not common, with the exception of things like savings accounts. You know, pure investment accounts sometimes can take additional reinvestment, but most physical projects that are built and profits are generated, those external profits have to be invested someplace else, and so we have to calculate this weighted average external rate of return. So that's I prime. I sub I is related to the external rate of return because that's the external reinvestment rate, that secondary location that you're putting all of the profits that are generated, which is a part of the weighted average. So I sub I is a subset or a component of I prime. All right, so here's the last one. The reason why I wanted to go over this terminology is that today we're going to have delta I star. And so the delta just means the rate of return on some increment or difference. So it means analyzing what's different between two options and how much profits can we get by investing in the bigger of the two alternatives. Okay, so here's an illustration of incremental analysis. And I'm going to do this one on Excel. If you want to follow along in Excel, you're definitely welcome to. This is going to set the stage for the in-class exercise that we do here in a few minutes. We've got two options. You can see I've already ordered the more expensive option on the right. So option B costs $73,000 up front now. And then at the end of every period, we have a profit of $26,225. Compared to option A, which costs less, but it generates less profits. So we want to know, we want to examine the difference between the two alternatives. So let me set this up in Excel. And remember that on the exam, you're going to have to start from a blank workbook. So as you start, maybe even now, preparing the equation sheet that you use on the second exam, you may consider putting together some prompts that would remind you how to do an incremental analysis. So we're going to compare option A and option B. And I just basically need to translate this same table. Let me paste it in so I've got it as a reference. All right. So option A minus 60,000, option B minus 73,000. And then the revenue that we get for option 1 is 22,000. And I can just continue that down through all of these rows, and then 26 to 25. Continue through these rows. Now the first thing we do in an incremental analysis is we're going to want to screen for suitability. So we want to see, like, do these pass the idea of, are they each individually yielding more than the MAR? And so let me start by calculating the internal rate of return. So equals IRR, parentheses, and then just all of the values. Okay, so 17% is the rate of return for option A. And let me just show another digit here. It's 17.3% for option A. And then once you've got the formula in, you don't have to type the formula again. We could just drag this formula to the side, and it's going to apply the same equation to the rows that are above it. So dragging it to the side gives me the IRR of the range for option B. And so option A yields 17.3%. Option B yields 16.3% for the IRR. Now the way that we use IRR here is for the initial screening. So I'm going to have here acceptable, like as a question mark. And the criteria is if the internal rate of return for the option is greater than the MAR, which 0.1, that means 10%, right? So since the internal rate of return is greater than the MAR, then yes, this is an acceptable option. We don't know yet which is best. We just know that they're both acceptable. So they both pass initial screening. So that tells me it is okay to do an incremental analysis now, comparing B to A. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to put a little bit of a space and then B minus A. And for the incremental analysis, you always have the more expensive option minus the less expensive option. So that's why we ordered it from left to right in terms of increasing amount. There's only two options here, but we'll, in our example today, have 6 options. And so we have to order it to make sure it's in order of cheapest on the left and gradually getting more expensive. And so equals option B minus option A. So it's 13,000 extra in cost, and then each year for 4 years there's an extra 42.25 in revenue. So what we're looking to find out is it worthwhile to spend an extra $13,000? If you do, what's the rate of return on the increment? Not the rate of return on the whole option. We already know that. What's the rate of return on the difference between B and A? So equals IRR on the increment. And it looks like the rate of return on the increment is 11.4%. So The main question here is, what should we do? Which decision should we make? And what this is telling us is we should select option B, because the IRR of the, well, what I introduced today was delta IRR, right? That's the rate of return on the increment. So let me see if I can insert that symbol there, the delta. So because the delta IRR is greater than the MAR. Well, that made things a little bit strange there in terms of the size. We should select option B because the internal rate of return on the increment is greater than the MAR. So the point is, you're going to have to borrow money to do option A or option B. Should you borrow $60,000 or should you borrow $73,000? You know, which is going to make the most profit for your company? And so the way to know is look at the difference between the two. Assuming that both of these are acceptable options and it's as a mutually exclusive where you're not going to buy them both. You're just going to buy one or the other. Should you buy the small one or the big one? This is saying that the extra $13,000 it takes to get option B instead of option A, it is worthwhile to get the bigger thing because the rate of return on the increment is 11.4%. And so that 11.4% is greater than the 10%, which is the minimum attractive rate of return, and we should do it. Now we can always double check to find out if the net present value agrees. And so the present worth analysis. So I'm going to say let's try present worth analysis to double check which option is most profitable. Okay? Because I told you present worth analysis is never going to give you a different answer than incremental analysis. It'll always identify which one is best. Okay, so present worth analysis, the fastest way to do it was with the NPV. So equals NPV. Now it's been a while since we did the NPV function. And there's a big warning that I gave you with the NPV function when we use it. Now first of all, you can see from the prompt it's asking for the rate. The rate we use is the MAR, minimum attractive rate of return. Okay, now does anybody remember the kind of the key to success to using the NPV function?
Is it only the values after year 0?
Good, exactly right. So the number one mistake students make with the NPV function, the mistake they make is putting in amounts that are already at the present. You only put future amounts into the NPV function. So we're going to put these amounts, which are in the future, into the NPV function, and then close the NPV function, and outside of it, add the amount that's already at the present. So that's the key to success with the NPV function, is just exclusively putting future amounts into it. So it tells us the net present value of option A is 9737. So what that means basically is if you had to borrow money to finance the project and you're paying 10% for the money that you borrowed, then the leftover profits that you actually get to keep, the present value of all those future profits is $9,737. Okay, so then let's do the same thing just to get practice. We could drag it sideways, but just to get practice with the correct use of the NPV function, equals NPV, the rate we use is the MAR, and then the values we put into the NPV function should only be future amounts. And then outside of the NPV function, we add the amount that's already at the present. So it shows option B is more profitable. So it's confirmed. So conclusion, the PW analysis confirms that option B is best. So does anybody have questions about this illustration? Well, I've got a question for you. Why even bother with incremental analysis? Like, if present worth analysis tells us which one is most profitable, why should we go to the trouble of doing incremental analysis?
So you can determine how much better it is, like so you can actually put value behind it.
That's right. Yeah. So that you can know, like you know that option B is more profitable than option A, but sometimes you need to know specifically that amount, which is the difference between the two. How much is that performing? Because remember, these are all just based on estimates. I think there's an old quote that says, prediction is hard to do, especially about the future. And so, like, we're assuming that option A is going to make $22,000. We're assuming option B is going to make 26. So if our increment is just like a razor thin margin, just very small margin better than the MAR, then we'd need to be aware of the fact that maybe our estimates could be wrong. And so sometimes in economic analysis, it's important to highlight specifically the performance of the difference between two options. So it's just another tool in our tool belt, basically, for decision making. All right, so decision criteria. You should always remember on an assignment, on an in-class exercise, in the exams, it's not enough just to say what the answer is. You should have it annotated, like with some text to the side of the answer that is specifically answering the question that was asked. So the grader shouldn't have to go into a spreadsheet and interpret it. You need to put like these little notes and highlight the answer to make it easy to find. And I think in general people have actually been doing a nice job of that this semester. But part of the answer being correct is stating the decision criteria. So not only like which option is best, but why. How do you know? So in our case, we should select option B. That's only part of the answer. You have to also say by what criteria did you judge that to be the best answer. And so here's our statement of the decision criteria. Because the incremental rate of return is greater than the MAR. So that's the statement of the decision criteria that like completes our analysis. So if the IRR of the difference is greater than or equal to the MAR, then the additional investment is justified. All right. So what if it's more than two options? This one's complicated, and it's important that you stay with me for just the next couple of minutes, because one of the greatest hits when it comes to mistakes students sometimes make on exams is they try and set up an incremental analysis in advance, all of the matchups, so to speak. Like you can think of it as a series of contests. Like we're going to be comparing A, B, C, D, and E. So we've got, in this illustration, 5 options. But the thing is we don't yet know what the matchups are going to be. Just like when you're making a tournament bracket, you can't have all of the games for the entire tournament known at the beginning of the tournament. Like you have to do round 1 before you know who is going to match up for round 2. I mean, everybody knows that, right? Like, I don't follow basketball, but I do know that you only know the first round of matchups, and then you have to see who wins for the next round. So the same thing is true here. If you've got multiple alternatives, the first matchup is obvious. It's going to be B versus A. But we don't know after B versus A, then we know what the next matchup's going to be. So the overall principle is that we should keep spending money as long as the increment is greater than the MAR. The rate of return on the increment is greater than the MAR, go for the more expensive option. So we'll start off with some initial screening. So you can see in this illustration, the MAR is 18%, and all of them have an internal rate of return greater than 18, so they all pass the initial screening of being suitable. So the first matchup of B versus A. So let's say we do a B versus A, and the rate of return on the increment is 22%. So what that tells us is, since the rate of return on the increment is greater than 18%, we should choose the larger of the two. So that means accept B. All right, so now in the matchup of A versus B, B was the winner. So our next matchup will be C versus B. A is out. A is done. It's like single elimination. We'll never see A again. So the next matchup, C versus B. We find the incremental cost, the incremental revenue, and the rate of return on the increment is 43%. So that tells us that we should go for C. So now both B and A are out. So the next matchup is C versus D. So we do C versus D. We find out the rate of return on that one is 0. So then that means reject D and keep C, because the rate of return on the increment for C versus D was less than the MAR. So our final analysis of E versus C has a rate of return less than the MAR. So the conclusion is that C is the best option here. So let me give you the paper for today's in-class exercise. We've got about 22 minutes to do this one. Which I think will be plenty of time. Okay, now, just to make things simple here, I think you should just refer to them by their letter, like C for Caterpillar, K for Komatsu, V for Volvo. Don't call them like A, B, C, D. Actually, label the variable based on the name of the equipment. So here, assume that they've got a 10-year lifespan. So when it says, for example, that the annual net revenue for Caterpillar is $10,200, that means you buy it once for $47,700, and then every year you have revenue in the amount of $10,200 for 10 years. So it's going to get set up just the same as this, as a starting point. Like if you're trying to think, what is the template going to look like for this in-class exercise? We want to do the initial screening with the IRR, and then you'll need to, after the initial screening, do the matchups to the side of it. So just like how I've got, here's the main column, and then to the side of it I've got the matchups. But one last warning, remember it should be in order of cheapest to most expensive, and I intentionally scrambled that. So when you set up the spreadsheet, have the cheapest option on the far left side and the most expensive option on the far right side. So you're going to have to reorder the columns from cheapest on the left to most expensive on the right. So I'm going to start working on the solution up on the screen here if you want to double check as you go. This is a really powerful technique. If you think about what we did, we started off with 6 options, and in just a couple of minutes, we were able to, one by one, eliminate the options that were more expensive but not yielding enough profits to justify. So let me point out that in the incremental analysis, we didn't bother with Komatsu. So in your homework or on the exam, if you do the incremental analysis and you include an option that should have been rejected through initial screening, that'd be a small point deduction. The point is you need to do this initial screening and apply the results. So in the incremental analysis, we did not include Komatsu because just from the very beginning, we could tell that the internal rate of return of that option on an absolute basis is unacceptable. So we sorted it from cheapest on the left, and then since Komatsu was eliminated, we did cat versus deer for the first one. And the rate of return on cat versus deer is only 11%. And since that's less than the MAR, that says reject the more expensive alternative. So cat was eliminated. Now the next matchup is Hitachi versus deer. So Hitachi versus deer has an incremental rate of return of 19%. So that says, yes, if you can borrow money for 12% and earn 19% on that money, then you should do that deal. So keep investing in the larger option as long as the rate of return is greater than the MAR. So the rate of return on that one was 19, the MAR was 12, so you can see accept Hitachi. It's our new champion, so to speak. So that the next challenger in the matchup would be then Volvo versus Hitachi. And so that has a negative rate of return. So that's a rejection for the Volvo. And then Atlas versus Hitachi. Internal rate of return is less than the MAR. So reject the more expensive alternative. Keep the Hitachi. So you can see that our final answer here of keep Hitachi. Hitachi is the best option. And then we have to also state the decision criteria, because the delta IRR for each option more expensive than the Hitachi was below the MAR. So that means the Hitachi is the best. Now how can we verify? If we just want to double check, present worth analysis. So let's do the present worth analysis on each option. So equals NPV at the MAR, and we'll put in the values that are in the future, and then outside of the NPV function, add the amount that's already at time 0. And we can just drag this function sideways. And what we're hoping is the case is we're hoping to see the largest present worth analysis value for the option that we already determined was the most profitable. So our incremental analysis said Hitachi is the best. Is that true here? Yeah. So the present worth analysis confirms Hitachi is the most profitable of all those alternatives. This is one of the big ideas of the semester, incremental analysis, and we'll use it again. This isn't the only time we'll look at increments. The other time we look at increments will be for projects that are done in the public sector. They're not necessarily being done to earn a profit, but there are projects that are worth doing even when they lose money. Like, for example, city parks or flood control reservoirs, stuff like that. So incremental analysis will be one of our powerful tools this semester. Before we go, let's just take one last look at the announcements here. I would encourage you to get an early start on the homework. You know, we've just done that incremental analysis. You've got one on homework 8, so you could get that done while it's fresh in your mind. And then also listen to that AI podcast. Let me know what you think. It's kind of crazy that in 5 minutes of looking at our class project, less time than it takes to read it, it generated an audio podcast about it. So it's pretty impressive technology. All right, I'll see you on Wednesday.
I have a question.
Yeah.